We're going to start Ari's talk in a little bit. Ari Brown is currently a senior at Tufts University. He's also dual enrolled in the New England Conservatory program. He does lots of work in computer science, but also in music, and he'll be presenting some of his work that kind of lies at the intersection of those two fields. He co-founded a startup called Cherrystems Music, which aims to make the process of music production much easier, and he'll be talking about a lot of his work in that domain. He's also worked at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. And yeah, so with that, I'll hand it off to Ari.
Hi everyone, I'm Ari. So today I'm going to be talking about what I call the Semantic-Hypnotic model of music perception. And okay, here we go. So a little bit about me. I'm from Indiana, and I'm in the program between Tufts University and New England Conservatory, where I study computer science and music composition. And I'm also very interested in piano performance and space. So to summarize this talk, first I'm going to give a little bit of music theory background, and then we'll go into the inspiration of the semantic hypnotic model, and then I'll talk about the model, and I'll go into how that influenced my view of human-computer interaction with respect to music. And then we'll go into a little bit of algorithmic detail. So, background. So the problem is that right now there's a bit of a misrepresentation between how humans think of music and how a computer represents music. So right now, this is how a computer typically represents music. This is basic classical music theory. And so what we have here we have a chord progression, and we have lots of Roman numerals under it. And when I think about music in my head, I'm not thinking about Roman numerals. I think a trained musician could try to do that, but we need to create a better match between how we're thinking about music and how a computer represents it. So right now, the computer representation for a lot of music is the MIDI representation, which basically means note pitches and note durations. And it doesn't encode the audio, but we have these note values that the computer can then run through to play a piece of music. So this is a typical image of the MIDI representation. So we have pitches and time. And so a little bit about the inspiration of this model. I took a class at New England Conservatory called 16th Century Counterpoint. And this goes back way before Western music theory was developed, before Bach's time. And it's a theory that's more driven by music perception. And the way it works is there are 5 types of accents that have to do with how we perceive a piece of music. So here are those 5 types. The first one is agogic, which means that any note that is long, followed by a bunch of short notes, is going to be more apparent to the listener. A cadential accent is usually found at the end of a musical phrase, and it usually pops out to the listener more because of that. A verbal accent has to do with the lyrics that are assigned to the notes. So a V, like a harsh syllable, will come out more to the listener. A melismatic accent has to do with holding a syllable over a long run of notes so that that syllable comes out more. And a tonic accent, lastly, has to do with a skip, a leap that's more than just a step, which will come out to the listener more. And so these are pretty simple concepts, but they impacted me a lot because they're more about the listener and less about how we construct music. And so I asked myself this question: is there a model that has to do with the perception of modern music? And so the requirements for that model would be that it's based on the audience's perception of the music, and that this model can span any genre, like any new age electronic music to also classical music. And so here we can see that modern music is a lot more complex than Western music theory in a number of different ways. And modern music production, it fills up the spectrum more. It fills up the range of human hearing. So there's a lot more that you can perceive at once because humans perceive many different frequency bands. And so we can pack in like a really high hi-hat in the 20,000 kilohertz, the 20,000 hertz region that we couldn't do in classical music theory. And so, yeah, a wide spectral range leads to more information in parallel. This is the way I think about music production. And so as a comparison, I have this spectrum, which I want you to notice that this is a performance that I did a long time ago, and it's just piano, and there's a lot of information coming at you, but the spectrum barely changes. The spectral shape stays the same throughout. We can play that. Oh, back one slide. And so throughout this example, there's a lot of information coming at you, but it's in the same range of human hearing. So as a comparison, here's a pop song that I produced, and what you can see is that in modern production, people fit the parts into the spectrum so that they complement each other. And so here's an example of that. And so you can see how the different parts variate and complement the other parts in the spectrum so that we can perceive a lot more information at once. And so how could we take simple perceptual rules and simplify something that's much more complex, like modern production? What system could we use? And so I propose this thing called the Semantic-Hypnotic model of music perception. And what this says is that every part in a piece of music lies on this spectrum between completely semantic and completely hypnotic. And what this means is semantic things, in my mind, are irregular. They pop out to the audience. They're linguistic in nature, and they provide meaning in a piece of music. On the other end, hypnotics are regular, they're atmospheric, and they provide the emotion in the piece of music. And so it's kind of like counterpoint of the 21st century. So the Semantic-Hypnotic model, it focuses on attention and perception, and it's inspired by a 16th century counterpoint, just as the 5 different types of accents popped out to the audience. So examples of semantics and hypnotics in music are a voice or any other melody is definitely semantic. Drum fills are usually irregular, so they also provide linguistic meaning to the piece. Bass fills are similar, or any other motif. As far as hypnotics go, a harmony, which provides support for the piece but doesn't pop out to the audience, is I would consider hypnotic. Or any repeated drums, a bass line that drives the harmony, or any other texture that's sampled, like noise. And I want to make the point that a piece of music, any part of a piece of music can be in the middle of the spectrum. So for instance, here's a harmonic progression, and if you tried to reimagine this harmonic progression in your head after hearing it once, you would imagine a line, which would be that melody line on top of the harmonic progression. Or you could maybe imagine the bass line. The outer parts are more salient. So in this case, this progression is mostly hypnotic because it's harmony, but there are linguistic components to it. For semantics, there are two different types of categories that I like to think of. And one of them provides identity to a piece of music, and the other one is more arbitrary, like a jazz solo. And so we can hear both of those. So the first one was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is a very well-known theme within that piece. The second one is just a jazz solo, which is still linguistic, but it's arbitrary. So here's a classical example of this type of analysis. And what I want to point out about this example is that the overall perceptual result constantly engages the listener. So if we go, yeah. So here's a string quartet that I finished a few years ago. And what you can see is that, and this happens a lot in classical music, is that the motifs constantly engage the listener. And it takes a lot of energy to listen to a piece of music, to actively listen to it. And so we can see that the different amount of semantics fit into each other and overall provide this constant line of semantics, which is the sum at the bottom. So in contrast, for a piece of pop music, the semantic-hypnotic level fluctuates more because in pop music, we don't always want to be actively engaged in listening. So it fluctuates between surprising and expected, and I think that this has a lot to do with what makes something catchy. In the beginning, there's more surprisal, and then we get more used to the same content as it loops, and our attention level goes down. So here is an analysis of a percussion line, a kick, bass, and harmony, and you can see that overall, the level of engagement with the music, the amount of semantics that we perceive changes over time. So we can play that example. So eventually you just groove with the piece of music and you forget about everything that was surprising about it. So I believe that the semantic-hypnotic model, if you could quantify the semantics, would allow us to predict the popularity of music for different genres. Because something that's highly hypnotic versus highly semantic, people want a certain middle range of complexity, and that's the type of music that the most people would listen to. So this is something that's still a work in progress that I'm working on trying to quantify. And my idea about quantifying the amount of semantics in a piece of music has to do with using entropy in two different ways. So this is a spectrum over time, and I feel that the amount of entropy is basically the amount of complexity in the music. And so entropy in a time slice would have to do with what different components you're hearing in terms of the spectrum. And entropy over time would have to do with how complex one part in a piece of music is and how it's changing. So I'm trying to combine these two measurements into to be able to quantify the semantics in a piece of music. And the significance of all of this is that the hypnotics in the music captivate us emotionally, and they allow the semantics to be more meaningful. So the emotion from a chord progression allows us to perceive lyrics more meaningfully. So I tried to apply this to human-computer interaction with my startup Cherrystems. And I believe that we can have a marriage between the representation of the way humans think of music and the representation in a computer. So the process for Cherrystems is that you sample things in your environment. Like you can sing a melody, you can tap a rhythm, you can record a sample, and you pick a style of music, and then you can share the music that's generated for you. So here's what that looks like. And the whole point is to realize the user's musical ideas without the user having to know anything about music. And what this boils down to in terms of semantics and hypnotics are the user is providing semantics, and the hypnotics are provided by the app. So now we have a little Cherrystems demo. So if you click the, so here's a bunch of sounds in a library that a user might have recorded. And that first one is a trumpet. Could we press play on that? I don't know if so a user could have played that, and now we can scroll down. So let's say the user provided those semantics. When we scroll down, we can pick a template, which is a style. This is the hypnotics that get provided from the app. And these hypnotics will adjust to the user's input. So this is that same song. And now let's try combining the user's input with that. So right now this is a little bit rudimentary because the melody keeps looping. But overall, this is a first step. It's our first iteration of Cherrystems for combining the semantics with the hypnotics. So now I'll show one other example. If we go back up and we select I'll find a way instead of the trumpet, which is the second one. And now we can hit rerun. Make music, yeah.
Find a way to get you off my mind. I'll find a way. I'll find a way. Yes, I'll find a way to get you off my mind. I'll find a way. I'll find a way.
So we're trying to automate this process for users that don't know anything about music. So we could return to the slides. Okay, cool. So a little bit more about the algorithm. My approach is to do this bottom up. So we have many production heuristics, which we want to consider what a producer would do when they're sitting down to produce a piece of music with someone else's melody. And right now, Cherrystems operates based on two parameters, the frequency parameter and time. So frequency roughly corresponds to the harmony in the piece of music, and time roughly corresponds to the rhythm. And so we need a lot of low-level capabilities here in order to produce a user's piece of music that a producer would be able to do themselves. So an example of one low-level capability that's needed is to automatically parse silence. And an algorithm that I really like is the edge detection algorithm for images. So so this is an image, and this algorithm can detect the sharp changes in an image, which we can see here, which are the edges. So we can apply that to audio production, and under the hood, this is a convolution with a Mexican hat wavelet, which is the second derivative of a Gaussian. And so I just took this wavelet and convolved it. I can convolve it with any audio signal of the user singing in whatever they want, and I can get the onsets, the edges between silence and sound. So here's what that looks like. We get a line at every onset of the audio. So this is one basic example of the type of things in a library in order to support automated production. So overall, this is a new paradigm in music creation because a user has never before been able to just give a computer what they're thinking of in their head in terms of musical ideas and combine that with whatever style they want. So the takeaway for this conference that I thought about a lot was AI doesn't have to be some magical thing in order to work. I would say with the correct theory and with the correct tools, you can make a very compelling result. And humans aren't magicians either. So in our case, we're trying to automate a producer's decisions. And I want to thank the machine intelligence community. I want to thank some of my mentors, John Malia, my teacher, Roger Graybill, Jay LaBeouf, and Lyle Davidson at NEC. And I want to thank the Cherrystems team as well. And thank you guys.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions.
Hi, thanks. I think this is really cool. So could you talk more about the details, like how exactly did you make it, like the algorithms, like after you did you come off the waveform, and then so you're combining the content from one music and the stuff from another music?
Yeah, so right now there's a format which specifies all of the hypnotics, the style.
Okay.
And that format includes a lot of rhythmic information and some instrument information, some sound samples. And we want any producer to be able to upload a piece in that format. And then the user, a lot of analysis needs to happen on the user end. If it's a melody, the pitches have to be analyzed. If it's a rhythm, the rhythm has to be analyzed. So there's a lot of different possibilities. And then we combine those right now by considering the harmonic content and the rhythmic content. Those are the basic two. One's time dependent, one's frequency dependent. And so it's a basic system, but it's definitely a first step towards producing something compelling.
How do you reconstruct the waveform from? Is that like MIDI?
So we don't actually. Do you mean the song?
Yeah, like how's the waveform generated from?
So the waveform it's a combination of all. We add these layers together. So we take the user's raw recorded input, and we can modify that a bit. Maybe one thing we're looking into is like making the user sound better, like auto-tune, some subtle auto-tune. And then we can take that and add that to our song's underlying framework. So really it's just adding waveforms on top of each other. And then we're also considering how do we mix these waveforms together.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Ari, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought this was really a great talk. I wondered if you wanted to talk any more about whether hypnotic aspects in songs always made them not as much about active listening, and if If that is the case, if they're always less active, is like the active energy that a listener will put into a song always going to be a good predictor for, the popularity or the success of that song?
That's something I really want to look into more. This was just a prediction that I had up there. But I do think that popularity should have something to do with how much attention a listener has to give to a piece of music. Mm-hmm. Because there's a middle ground, which has to do with the fluctuation between semantics and hypnotics. People don't always want to be actively listening.
Yeah.
That's my
Someone once told me that like freshly ground black pepper versus the stuff that comes out of a can was like the difference between listening to the Rolling Stones and listening to a Rolling Stone. And I thought that was funny, but then I reflected, I don't always like have the energy to listen to like a live performance of the Rolling Stones. I don't always really want to engage at that level. So I just thought that was interesting for a future model prediction.
Yeah, I'll try to keep quantifying that so I can try to map things to actual popularity in genres. Thanks.